of all, thank you to the organizers. It has been a splendid idea to celebrate Mario, who is the subject of what would have seemed an impossibility. He's retiring. That is not reasonable. That's not coherent. That's not anything. But we are invited to believe it, and as realists, some of us will have to accept it. Rejoicing that his production has been so prolific, increasingly in the last 10 to 15 years, that he will continue in that mood and then he will transform philosophy even further. I don't know if I will transform anything, but what I will do is some kind of, oh no, how do I, here. So I will go through a suggestion. Mario is a strong realist. I am a weak realist. They will make the outrageous claim that his work on realism helps very much the pursuit of weak realisms, much weaker than he might like, but he has been influential in that regard, as he has been influential in so many other ways. Realism used to be taken as a very demanding expectation. Expectations were huge. Theories were to be taken as integral wholes rather than a construct made of separable parts. They had to postulate universal laws in a very strong sense. They described, or were supposed to describe, intended empirical domains correctly at the fundamental level, and so on and so on. And it is interesting that now practically no realist takes all of those simultaneously together or very seriously. So things have changed. How did it happen? Well, since the 1960s, anti-realists were busy criticizing the expectations I just listed. Kuhn, Van Frassen, and Lauden are the heroes of that movement of reform and destruction of realism. Meanwhile, realists, or defenders of realism, were becoming less greedy about their claims. So here is how Bernard McMullen, in 1984, characterized the experiential ground zero of scientific realism. The near invincible belief of scientists is that we come to discover more and more of the entities of which the world is composed through the constructs around which scientific theory is built. So the crucial belief is that we learn more and more of what exists in the world, not about theories, not about grand things, but about what various domains in nature are like in significant ways. McMullen was reacting to growing claims that science yields no substantive retention of theoretical description and no referential stability. That's the arguments from Kuhn, from Weyerhaven, from Van Frassen, from Lauden, different arguments, different approaches, but the same kind of skeptical eye towards realist claims. The ensuing disputes led most philosophers of science to take intermediate positions, and one of those intermediate positions matured into the contemporary form of what we call selective realism, of which deployment realism is one chapter. So what do selective realists agree on? Well, they agree that empirical theories lack stability at the level of fundamental ontology. We have wildly different ontologies underpinning what is more or less unified experience. Fundamental ontology, not intermediate, fundamental. Secondly, radical conceptual change seems to be a recurrent scientific phenomenon. And this is not only at the level of theories. Radical conceptual revision occurs at the level of cats and dogs and whatever it is. All our ontologies have been changing radically. Yet, selectivist note, significant descriptive continuities exist at intermediate theoretical levels. That is to say, a false theory may contain parts that are true as past theories seem to have done. Which are those parts? Identifying those parts is the task of selective realists. There have been many flavors in contemporary projects. You have structural realism that was led by John Worrall in 1989, recommending that epistemically we should commit only to the mathematical or structural content of scientific theories. This frugality didn't appeal to many realists who reacted. And so there were alternatives proposed. One very prominent alternative was by Philip Kitcher in his book on the advancement of science, which is more tolerant of content, theoretical content. So it's not just that you save mathematical structure, which you may, but also some content. Some of the theoretical fabric, some of the theoretical story is also saved, and that's what makes for a richer, more generous type of realism. Now, Kitcher, in that book, sought to link novel success to theoretical content. In particular, to theory parts thought crucial to the derivation of corroborated novel predictions and fruitful explanation, both. In Kitcher, you have both. There has been a tilting towards novel prediction in more recent years, but with Kitcher, you have the whole thing. And so a scientific theory, according to Kitcher, is composed of theoretical constituents, some of which, only some of which, are working posits, and the others are idle posits. For example, you have in the classical theory of electromagnetism, the working posit of having, for example, electromagnetic waves of microscopic wavelengths. You also have other posits like the ether, which is quite important and quite guiding in the derivations of many of the novel predictions that led to the success of electromagnetism. But those, Kitcher wants to say, are idle posits. You can drop them without changing the explanatory nature at a certain level. Now, these formulations that Kitcher proposed have issues, and intelligent members of the next generation were quick to point out some of their failures. So Timothy Lyons, for example, pointed out that by Kitcher's light, credit had to be attributed to all responsible constituents. But what are the all responsible constituents? Everything. So how are you going to make the distinction between idle and working? You end up having as influential, if you go by the history of science, heuristics, mystical beliefs, weak analogies, mistaken calculations, logically invalid reasoning, all that has played in the great story of science a great deal of work. It seems to have been working. So the idea that we should commit only to those hypotheses deployed essentially was insisted on, but it had to call for a reform. And that reform was produced by some members of the profession, most conspicuously Stathis Silos, who responded to the challenge by offering a variant which seems to respond to the critics of Kitcher. Silos presented the scientific theory as something composed of a stable and unstable theoretical constituents. Now, the stable constituents are not the working posits because everything is working, but the ones that are actually deployed to predict specific phenomena. So you make a specific prediction, you take your local history of research, and then you invoke a particular posit, you deploy it in your calculations, and you draw some inferences. So how do you identify the essential posits? The novel prediction must follow from the hypothesis, together with other hypotheses that are taken for granted, including auxiliary assumptions, but not from those assumptions alone. So the theory in question, or the theory part in question, has to be crucial to the derivation. Secondly, no other hypothesis, H star, should be available which can do the same job as H. If there is another, then you have a case of underdetermination. You have no right to attribute any significance to the hypothesis. Now, this is promising, but regrettably, the criterion 2 proved problematic, and critics were quick to develop also objections, several objections. One is that condition 2, that there should be no alternative hypothesis that does the same job, is too vague to be applicable. When is an alternative not available? It depends on the imagination of the researcher. You can always have available what in logical space. So that's not good enough. Another line of reaction was that for practically any superseded account, you can always indulge in retrospective projection of current theory that quickly singles out parts in the discarded theory. And then you say, you see, because the discarded theory agrees in this part and that part with current theory, those are the parts that were indispensable. But then that's also self-serving, because you can always do that, it seems, and so that's no good. It depends again on the imagination of the individual researcher. Furthermore, Stanford further objected that there is a traditional, he said, realist goal of identifying the parts that are true in a theory while the theory is still going. And that was a claim. But where does this claim come from? Well, he didn't tell us. It's just something taken for granted. He just demanded that. Finally, there was the option, the pragmatist option of asking scientists for clues about, well, which ones are the dispensable in this piece of science. But scientists are big dreamers. They overindulge. They are known to overindulge. They are not objective when it comes to their theories. So you are going to get lost if you simply take that road. So we got the quest for a realistic realism, what I'm calling realistic realism. These difficulties forced selectivists to clarify and refine their project, particularly the notions of empirical success, theory part, indispensability, and approximate truth. And as we've seen, Ilika, for example, has been doing great work on that regard, and so have many other colleagues, including our beloved Mario. So, proposals developed over the last 2 decades acknowledge their limitations. One of the most attractive current projects, I suggest, is to make selective realism more realistic and tenable. What does that mean? Realistic is a project that seeks to recognize its imperfections and deal with them accordingly. Alai's contributions have been numerous in that regard, I would suggest, and over the last decade, he has produced a fruitful hermeneutical exegesis of the project proposed by Silos 99, articulating how deployment should be understood if we are to give deployment realism its most favorable reading. This is important because most of us went to the jugular of Silos's proposal. How can we find fault? And so we just enjoy that. That's how we make papers, that's how we get tenures, that's how we live, by biting into the jugular. But that's not really constructive. What is Silos claiming? What does he want? And there is a very good story that Mario, I think, has unearthed that shows how the fruitful project can be developed. Now, the contributions in these directions are many. I just take 7, 1 for each capital theme. And, well, they are Lyon's rejection of deployment realism as completely wrong. Empirical success as indicator of truth content. Then the idea of truth content, the idea of theory part, the distinction between essential and inessential content, fallibilism, and then the confutation of anti-realist examples adduced against, in this case, selective realism in general. So first, on the rejection of deployment realism by Timothy Lyons. It has 2 sides. On the one hand, there is Lyons' critique of the essentiality requirement and his view that deployment realism ultimately fails. And then Mario's defense on improved version of the criterion for deployment realism. In a seminal paper by Lyons that has been very influential from 2002, Lyons argues that in history, many theoretical assumptions actually led to successful novel predictions, even though they were false. And this is, I think, unproblematically true. You can see that they really led. I mean, the scientists were imbued with these claims, and then the claims led to nice predictions, and yet the theories were really off the mark. Mario counterattacks with precisions about epistemological fabric, the epistemological fabric of empirically successful deployment. And he proposes an improved criterion. What is that criterion? There is no other hypothesis, H prime, which is a proper part of H, hence weaker, which together with other hypotheses on auxiliary assumptions entails P. So it's not just another hypothesis. It is another hypothesis which is a proper part. So mereology is called for here, crucially. Now this revised precision criterion draws from precisions about how empirical success marks probable truth content in novel predictions. That's another aspect that Mario has taken very seriously, the connection between truth attribution and novel prediction. So empirical success as an indicator of truth content. This has been a theme in the last half a century in contemporary philosophy of science, analytic philosophy of science at any rate. Its champions include Ronald Giere's perspectival approach, Penelope Maddy on the importance of novel prediction, and, well, Mario himself, several of his references has been particular about it. The considerations they raised, I would subsume under what I'm calling thesis R. What is this thesis? A hypothesis, empirical success, and fertility strongly indicate that at least some of the theoretical content it assumes is approximately true. Some. So when you have success, you have some truth somewhere. Now you get people saying, oh, how, there is always something. But if you go for the essentiality condition, then that's not so simple. So it is quite revealing. You are never going to have a fully precise, absolute terminal rendition of the domains of the empirical world, but you will get more and more of it. The insight is that the probability of deriving a true proposition from a false premise in the expected is the expected random value under the epistemic situation at hand. In Alai's version, a hypothesis H deployed towards a novel prediction and is very probably true if it was essentially to deriving a novel prediction, not otherwise. To say that a novel prediction follows from a false hypothesis H would entail that the scientist doing the derivation was extremely lucky. Of course, we have a debate, as Dennis reminded us so strongly and forcefully yesterday, so we'll keep talking about this. A third theme is truth content. So Alai's analysis starts from the claim that the probability of a false premise leading to a corroborated prediction, novel prediction, corresponds to the random value of the epistemic situation. The idea is that once a risky novel prediction is derived from a hypothesis or theory part, and that part is corroborated, the prediction is corroborated, we effectively know, that is to say, know with high probability, that short of miracles, there is some truth in it. This, he advises, is enough to respond to the skeptics. What is the theory part then? Mario follows Iaplo, who does a meteorological analysis of theory parts, according to which a hypothesis H star is part of a hypothesis H, if and only if it is entailed by H and preserves its subject matter. So a hypothesis H star entailed by H preserves its subject matter if and only if every truth maker or false maker of H star is entailed by a truth maker or false maker of H. Think, for example, of the transition from the very rich ether-based ontology of electromagnetic waves or light waves to the post-Einsteinian alternative, in which all you have is Hertz's equations, the descriptions of the micro amplitudes or micro wavelengths for electromagnetic phenomena. So waves that are objective, that are existing, but nothing about the background to the ether. So that's an example of the proper theory part. And that proper theory part is what ends up satisfying the indispensability condition as far as you know today. Maybe we'll discover something else tomorrow, but then one would say, learn your lesson from Newton, who says, of course it could be different. Descartes had been insisting, and the Cartesians more than Descartes, had been insisting that you have to bear in mind the possibilities, possible worlds. And Newton was saying, no, you just proceed until specific reasons show up against your suggestion. Then you act. An intuition recovered by some pragmatists in the late 20th century, like Dudley Shapiro. Fifth theme, essential and inessential parts. There is no other hypothesis H prime, which is a proper part of H. What does that mean? That is to say, a weaker hypothesis. This is meant to explicate, I take it, the selectivist insight that we should credit those and only those constituents that were genuinely responsible for, that is to say, deposits that actually led scientists to specific predictions. So we could amalgamate the languages of Silos and Alai and say that age indispensably contributes to the generation of a novel prediction, even though if clauses 1 and 2 prime are met, not 1 and 2, but 1 and 2 prime. The sixth theme is fallibilism. This is crucial. How do we know that a hypothesis is used essentially? Alai agrees with Stanford and other skeptics that essentiality cannot be detected prospectively. He denies, however, that essentiality needs to be claimed prospectively. So you cannot, but you need not claim it prospectively. The key claim is that the components of discarded theories, which were essentially involved in novel predictions, are most probably true. And even more probably, they contain, if they are not true, they contain essential parts that are true. Now, it is the case that science proceeds within metaphysical dreams, and metaphysical dreams can be quite obstructive. In the days of Maxwell, in the days of Fresnel, one dream was an old classical ontology for physics that was introduced by the medievals and taken to apotheosic levels by Descartes, in which what you have is the metaphysics of modes of being. You cannot have a smile without someone smiling. You cannot have a mode of being without a being. You cannot have a wave without a substratum, because a wave is the propagation of a deformation, and the deformation needs to be a deformation of something. So it is amazing when you go to the 19th century. At the end of the 19th century, people didn't have internet or television. They had the books that summarized knowledge at the end of the century. And they had a chapter on physics. And the greatest achievement of physics was the ether, something that is going to stay, it's the ether. Well, it didn't. And so what happens is that through Einstein and others, we learned how to disentangle physics from received metaphysics. Now we can think of the smile of Cheshire cat without the cat. We do that in physics. In field theories, you do have that. Magnitudes that have no identified substratum. Finally, there is a computation of anti-realist examples. The examples were very convincing because they were true. I mean, there are many cases in which you deployed ideas that were completely false for the benefit of getting very, very amazing predictions. A good exemplar is Kepler's theory, charming theory. Kepler had a Baroque imagination. He was full of ideas, charming ideas, all of them. And so, from what looks at first sight like completely false premises, he derived amazing, or seemingly derived, amazing predictions. For example, that the sun spins. For example, that the planet's speed is highest at its perihelion and lowest at its aphelion. And of course, the three laws. Now, that's quite a remarkable achievement. What was the basis? A set of false assumptions. And Lyons sorted out 4 basically that were completely false assumptions, like, well, the sun has an anima motrix. Well, the sun has no anima motrix, and so on. Or an Aristotelian theory of motion that says planets move now that there are no celestial spheres. only if they are pushed in the direction of their motion, and when they are not pushed, they stop. Well, what kind of assumption is that? Certainly false, according to us. But there were facts bequeathed from the Copernican model. So Kepler was reasoning, if Copernicus is right, then some direct consequence of the model was that the planets move around the sun on the same plane in the same wise. And also that the order of the velocities or the planets, once you take that claim seriously, is inverse to that of their distances from the sun. So the specific claims 1 to 4 are false, but Mario's reaction is, and yet they contain truthful parts or statements that have positive truth values. So he runs through them and he says, well, for example, the solar system moves around the center of the sun as a coherent rigid disk. 6, its coherence is mainly due to an influence, not necessarily to the rays of the sun that are pushing the sun up. There is an influence, so it's a more abstract rendition. Instead of saying an Aristotelian force, it is an influence, a causal influence. Somehow the sun is causing this. Also, the velocities of the planets are approximately proportional to that influence. 8, the force is in inverse relation to the distance. Now, what is the point? That the theory contained the core that, as far as we know, is true, remains true. There were the 3 laws, but the 3 laws need to be appreciated. They are crucial to the great predictions made from Kepler's theory and which crowned Kepler after his death in the Rudolphine tables. The laws have considerable independence from Kepler's speculations. In particular, even if one challenges the partial truths I just mentioned, the laws, the 3 laws, can be taken as kinematical laws. Why? Because Kepler is a great geometer, was doing projective geometry and trying to see how the solar system would look like if you placed yourself above. And then, well, you see an ellipse. And then you see, well, the relation of areas per times. And then you see the magnificent law of the cube of the average distance to the sun and the square of the yearly period for the planet. And that's remarkable. So I think there is a case to be made for the essentiality condition playing a big role. And the same is true, and Mario does it in especially a paper from 2021, I think, with other examples, the most egregious examples raised against deployment realism. So the above case, which is just one of the many cases Alai deals with, shows how Mario's critical revision works. Now, I will make the irreverent suggestion that although Mario's realism is intended for something stronger, it also helps weaker types of realism, like the one I am close to or closest to, which is what I call sometimes functional realism, a perspective multiply revived in recent literature by people like Satsi, Eck, myself, and others, and in its current version claims that theoretical entities and regularities are identified by what they do rather than what they ultimately are or made of. So there is an opacity to realism. Realism is not in the truth of fundamental theories, is in the claims, more concrete level claims, intermediate level claims. The precursors, well, you find precursors in Evandro's operational content approach to realism, not in other aspects of Evandro's. In Toraldo di Francia, on theoretical representation, which is a forgotten contribution, I think. And then the great figures in science who anticipated, I would suggest, this kind of functional realism were Galileo, in his letters to the Duchess Christina, when he wants to separate religion from science, and Newton, in his hypothesis non fingo, and his fourth rule of reasoning in the optics. So, characterized by what they do rather than what they are, the deep nature of entities and processes selected for realist commitment are left opaque, but not their intermediate natures. So what we learn is about intermediate natures. Is this the fundamental nature? We don't know. It is not that we are forbidden to learn. We just don't know. We don't have those resources. The entities and processes approved for ontological commitment are the ones that are deemed indispensable for the empirical success of the theory at hand. Hence, an affinity with Mario's work. The parts selected for commitment are functional rather than fundamental, emergent within the contingencies of an empirical domain, and the descriptions associated with them are effective rather than exact. Like Kepler's part with positive truth content. So this leads to a modest realist proposal, too modest for Mario perhaps, but there we are. Still, the approach here recommended is realist in that it takes the theoretical entities and structures as being physically at play in the intended domain and to behave approximately as their description says. That's all you need for being a realist, I would suggest. Not extravagant claims about having grasped, harpooned on the ultimate nature, the ultimate natural kinds, the ultimate ism. These are nice fantasies. The goal is to scientifically identify truth content in successful theories. In Kepler's theory, you end up identifying a little element of astronomical reality for the solar system and other systems, and that is preserved, remains in place in subsequent theories like Newtonian gravitation and general relativity. So I end with a quote from Margolin with which I began. This existential background to realism that says, the near invincible belief of scientists is that we come to discover more and more of the entities of which the world is composed through the construct around which scientific theory is built. We know more. We have learned about the entities. We have learned about quantum objects, many specific quantum objects, many unbelievable biological entities that we never dreamed of, many structures in chemistry, many structures in psychology, and so on and so on, and we keep learning. My suggestion, which is daring, because as I said, Mario may want a much stronger type of realism, is that thanks to his contributions and the keen thinkers, Margolin's noted near invincible belief of scientists is now more realistic and tenable than ever. Thank you, Mario.